Welcome back to the Independent Republic of Mike Graham. Time to say a very good morning to Dr. Rakib Ehsan from the Henry Jackson Society. Rakib, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Mike. How are you?
Yeah, very well indeed. We've got an interesting report of yours to discuss coming up shortly. But let's kick off, first of all, with the decision this morning on Shamima Begum. You and I have discussed her plight many times. I think mostly you and I have agreed that we shouldn't be inviting her back here, because if she was invited back here, we'd never get rid of her, and we'd probably be supporting of the rest of her life.
Well, I'd make the point that when it comes to judicial decisions, I think both of us have been very critical in the past when it comes to matters of national security. So in this case, the Supreme Court's decision was for me surprising, but ultimately a welcome one, because I feel that all too often our legal system functions in a way that prioritizes the individual rights of those who have a very dubious history, including joining prescribed organizations, over the interests of collective public safety. And that really needs to change. So in that sense, I'm supportive of this decision by the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I was a bit like yourself. I was surprised too, because I was expecting them to be very sort of liberal and lily-livered about it, and to say, oh, well, you know, she was only 15 when she was taken out of the country against her will. She was persuaded because she was so young. I don't go with that whatsoever. Also, she took part in some pretty horrendous acts, did she not, when she married the guy who's now in prison, I believe, in the Netherlands, who was in ISIS, who was seen and was known to have killed people in a pretty brutal and horrific way. She took part in some of that activity, didn't she?
Well, Mike, let's address the point on age. She was 15 years of age when she left the UK to join a barbaric organisation, which has been prescribed by the UK Home Office. She was 15. That means she was comfortably above the age of criminal responsibility in England and Wales, which is 10. Now, in terms of what she may have done, there are accounts which suggest that she participated in ISIS's police morality unit. So essentially meting out violent punishments to women who are found to have breached morality codes. So I think a really important point to make here was that there were reservations in terms of the public authorities' ability to collect evidence, to investigate offences in conflict zones abroad. So the chances of prosecution, it's very interesting that there's existing government data which suggests that only 1 in 10 ISIS returnees are prosecuted.
Right.
And that is largely because of the difficulties in terms of collecting that evidence. So you have to take these, we have to bear this in mind when we are examining today's decision by the Supreme Court.
Well, that's right. Because I think you've said to me in the past that there's been something like 400 people returning from that part of the world where they were fighting for ISIS in some way, shape or form. They might not have all been quite as active as Shamima Begum, but they certainly were involved with ISIS, weren't they?
Well, I think that these individuals that you speak of, they represent a serious risk pool in British society. And I think that the wider British public would be seriously angered by the fact that there are that many people who have returned from foreign conflict zones where they were assisting and ultimately joined prescribed organizations that they've now been almost, they've been allowed to return back to the UK.
Right. And how well are any of those people or all of those people being monitored?
Well, I think that's definitely something that the public authorities really need to step up their efforts. But in terms of the individuals that we speak of, as we've said before, the prosecution rate, Mike, is very low. And I think that may well have factored in the decision made today.
Yes, because no doubt, as Julie Hartley-Brewer said to me this morning, if she had come back, no doubt we would have had to pay for her to have a new identity assigned to her. We would have probably had to pay for her to be housed somewhere. I mean, I think her children, two of her children died, or did all three of them die? I don't know if she's got children anymore.
Well, I'd make the point there that ultimately I think the public appetite for Shamima Begum to return was very, very low.
Yeah.
And I think that as we've seen there with the court ruling, that all too often when we've looked at previous judicial decisions, they haven't prioritized the interests of national security and collective public safety. And that really needs to change, that legal culture, you could say. I think that all too often we've heard people make excuses, or she was young, she was impressionable. Ultimately, what she did, she left the United Kingdom as a British citizen to join a barbaric organization. Quite frankly, Mike, I have a lot more sympathy for the Yazidi women who have been systematically brutalized and locked in sexual slavery under Islamic State's barbaric regime. And that's something that people who are sympathetic towards Shamima Begum, they don't like to talk about that aspect of the issue.
And as far as this legal journey is concerned, does she have any place else to go now, or is that the end? I mean, the Supreme Court's basically it, isn't it? I don't think we can now have appealing to the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, can we?
Well, I think her legal team will explore their options, but the reality about it, the decision here is a crushing blow for her. But we have to be very firm in expressing and ultimately putting forward the view that there are serious consequences for your citizenship if you decide to join a proscribed organization.
Right. As there should be. I mean, you shouldn't just be able to go off and, become an enemy of the state. And then because it suits you or because the circumstances have changed, you can just come back as if nothing's ever happened.
Oh, Mark, I couldn't agree more. All too often when we talk about citizenship, I hear people talk about rights, but what about the responsibilities?
Yeah. Exactly right. Let's talk a little bit about your report, which was always going to be the main focus of this conversation before the Shamima Begum result came in. 1 in 6 Black Britons only believes that tearing down statues in the wake of Black Lives Matter is a legitimate form of protest. This is a study that you did at Henry Jackson Society. Rakib, tell us about it.
Well, Mike, a big part of the report, I wanted to explore the representativeness of the BLM movement, especially in respect of their hard left radical objectives and goals. So this would include replacing the UK's market economy with the socialist system, aspiring for the eventual abolition of the police, and expressing support for forms of direct action in the name of Black liberation. Now, what the report found was that while Black Brits, they do feel that there's serious issues with racism in British society, and that there are definitely improvements to be made in terms of social cohesion, equality of opportunity, improving the relationship between the state and its citizens. When it comes to those hard left radical objectives and behaviors, there's very little support. So fewer than 1 in 5 Black British people support reduced investment for their local police force. Only a quarter support replacing British market capitalism with a socialist arrangement. And as you say, when it comes to forms of civil disobedience and violent action, politically motivated violent action, support for this, or rather seeing these as legitimate forms of political protest, the figures are very, very low, Mike. As you say, only 16% of Black British people consider toppling statues as an acceptable form of political protest. And that drops even lower to 8% for the general population. And I felt that that is a very important part of the story, because the reality of the matter is, Mike, when you move out the inner city areas in London, Birmingham, Leeds, Bristol, many people in the general population probably don't have any close ties with a single Black British individual. So when it comes to building their perceptions, they'll see a lot in the news and the media about what's going on with the BLM protests. So I really wanted to shed light on the representative, or rather the unrepresentative nature of the BLM movement and its radical objectives.
Well, I think, as most of us witnessed during the summer of last year, the people that tore down the statue in Bristol mostly were white. The people who were marching around London, throwing bottles at the police, were mostly white. I see that you've been criticised by some bloke called Dr. Liam McLaughlin from Birkbeck College about your efforts to somehow divide the BLM movement with this report. He's also white.
Well, I'd make the point that apparently he read the 20,000-word report in 5 minutes.
Well, maybe he's a very clever bloke, clearly.
And that's probably why he missed a policy recommendation that called for tougher anti-racism regulations for the labour market and ways we can increase vaccine uptake in distrustful Black British communities.
Yes.
What a nasty person I am.
I know. But I mean, this is typical of the left, isn't it? They attack you and try to single you out. As some cases, this happened to Calvin Robinson as well, a man who basically talks an awful lot of common sense, but because he doesn't spin the left-wing narrative that he's expected to, on the grounds that his skin may be slightly darker than some other people's, he gets called a sort of an Uncle Tom and even worse names.
Oh, absolutely, Mike. I've seen that some of the racism that Calvin Robinson has experienced is absolutely shocking. The level of racism that is faced from hard left pro-BLM activists. And I think it's very interesting in the report. It showed that 8% of Black British people have experienced racial or ethnic discrimination at the hands of another Black person.
Mm.
And I think that needs to be an important part of the debate when we talk about racism and community tensions. The reality matter is, Mike, that there's no such thing as a singular Black community.
Well, I was about to bring you onto that subject, because you talk about this a lot, and I think it's a really important delineation that you make, Rakib, because it's ridiculous, isn't it, to talk about all white people being the same and all Black and minority ethnic people being the same. It simply isn't true.
Absolutely. So if we look at the white population in the UK, that there are differences even between people who would be classified as white British and people who would be classified as white Irish. There's differences there in terms of how their children perform at school, for example.
And maybe now white Scottish as well.
Absolutely. And then when you look at the notion of there being a Black Britain, that there is a Black Britain, essentially a single voice population, that just isn't backed by the data at all. There's very notable differences between Black British Africans and Black British Caribbeans. So something that I clearly stated in the report was that when compared to Black British Caribbeans, Black British Africans are more likely to be positive about UK race relations, the shape that they're in.
Yeah.
They're more likely to report having a stable family unit during their childhood, a stable family life. They're more likely to attach importance to their religious identity. And crucially, when compared to Black British Africans, Black British Caribbeans, Black British Africans are more likely to report being satisfied with their life in the UK. So I think this idea of there being a singular Black community is deeply unhelpful when we're looking to set social policy. And it really reduces the quality of broader political discourse in our country.
And what now for the BLM movement, do you think? Because we've seen, I would say, a kind of an evaporation, if you like, of intensity in terms of people talking about it as much. We've got individual footballers now standing up and saying, we don't think that we should be kneeling, taking the knee anymore. It doesn't seem to have any importance to us as British people, which I think is probably right. But they've also tried to become a political movement, haven't they? How's that going?
Well, I think it's interesting that we are seeing a football backlash now. So, for example, Wilfred Zaha at Crystal Palace, he says that the act of taking a knee is degrading. And I do actually think that in some ways it is lazy. Some people think, oh, I've taken the knee, I've done my job now for anti-racism in the UK.
Yes.
And I do think that, well, that's a bit of a good, a lot more needs to be done. You've taken a knee, that's not the end.
Given what we are told is the level of racism being directed at individual footballers on social media, you would suggest that it's not doing the job that it's supposed to be doing at all. Quite the reverse.
I think all too often when it comes to the gesture of taking the knee, I think there's a great deal of virtue signaling involved. There are people who think that, oh, I've done this now, I've done my job for anti-racism in the UK. I thought Lyle Taylor, who's at Nottingham Forest, he ultimately said that much more needs to be done in terms of combating racism in the UK, trying to create a more meritocratic society, a fairer society. But the thing is, Mike, when we look at the hard left objectives that we've discussed, when it comes to the eventual abolition of the police, dismantling the market economy, that goes far beyond the traditional bread and butter racial fairness issues that we need to address as a nation. And they actually run the risk of alienating many people from the anti-racism movement.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. Dr. Rakib Ehsan, great to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Rakib Ehsan from the Centre on Radicalisation and Terrorism, the Henry Jackson Society. I've tweeted out his report, which is very interesting and makes for a very interesting reading as well. So you should get on that if you want to do it. Go and find it on my Twitter account as well.